Welcome to Film and Page. I'm Dominic, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the 2021 novel The Shadow, written by James Patterson and Brian Sitz, published by the Hatchet Book Group. The version I have is the ebook format, and it is 378 pages in length. Well, he said, leaning forward. You had something you wanted to tell me. Margot just smiled, her thin eyebrows slightly arched. Is that the Titanic? She asked, pointing towards a corner of the ceiling where a model of a large steamship hung between two pairs of brass opera glasses. I think that would be in poor taste considering, said Lamont, squinting into the collection overhead. It's probably the Queen Mary. You're probably right, said Margot. She looked like she was about to say something else, but before she could speak, two plates were already being set on the table. The service in this place was impeccable. On each plate, gobs of snowy white lobster meat nestled in a tangle of chopped greens, topped with a lace of cream sauce and flecked with small croutons. Lamont and Margot each spared a morsel of lobster. They lifted their forks and tapped them together in a playful toast. To us, said Lamont. To secrets, whispered Margot, her eyes on his. She slid a chunk of lobster into her mouth as Lamont took his first small bite. You can't hold out forever, you know, he said. I have my methods. Maybe I'm just holding out for dessert, said Margot. Her eyes widened. She dropped her fork. Lamont! Her voice was suddenly pinched and pained. At that same moment, Lamont felt a hot rush in his skull, like somebody had just set his frontal lobes on fire. His throat tightened in a sharp spasm, and his hands flew up reflexively to his neck. Margot's head rolled back as a small stream of white foam oozed from between her rose-tinted lips. Her slender body went limp. Lamont knew instantly what had happened, but his vocal cords were tightening. He could barely squeeze out the word. Poison. So now I'll talk a bit about my background with the character of the Shadow and writer James Patterson and Brian Sitz. I've always had a love for these gritty, street-level, detective-type characters. You know, that two-fisted detective-style superhero like Batman, Daredevil, and of course the precursor to them, the Shadow. But I don't consider myself like a hardcore Shadow fan. I'm just more of a casual one. Now, I first became aware of the Shadow in the late 1980s when I picked up a few of the Shadow comics being done by writer Andrew Helfer and artist Bill Sienkiewicz for DC Comics. And this was at the height of my Batman craze. So any character that was similar to Batman or had that same feel, I was seeking them out. So the Shadow fit that bill perfectly, as he was dark, mysterious, and more on the gothic side. But as a side note, if you ever get a chance to pick up some of the Shadow comics that were done by the aforementioned writer-artist team, do so. The painted covers and interior art, they're really amazing. They're really well done. But it wasn't until 1993 that I discovered there was an old radio show for the Shadow. And that's when I really started to learn more about the character. Before that, I just assumed or thought he was just another DC character. And I didn't know that he had this long history and he was actually a precursor to Batman. And a lot of the elements that Batman has was actually lifted from the Shadow. Now, they would play the radio show on this local radio station in my area late at night. So sometimes I would stay up to listen to the show or record it and listen to it the next day. And at that time, this is when the Shadow movie was about to come out, starring Alec Baldwin. So there was a lot of buzz around for that. And but when it did come out, I actually never got to see it in theaters, and I wouldn't get to see it for a few years after it was out. It was probably like 3 years later after it was released in theaters that I finally got around to watching the movie. But I did read the novelization as soon as that came out. As that hit the bookstands, I picked it up and read it. And then when I actually got around to seeing the movie, I actually liked the novelization of the movie actually a bit better in some ways. But the movie was pretty good. I did enjoy it. I thought it was a pretty solid superhero movie, and it wasn't bad. As for James Patterson, he's an author that I'm aware of because he's like Danielle Steele. You always see their books at drugstores and grocery stores. So that's how I'm aware of them. Every time you go into a drugstore or grocery store, you look on the newsstand, you see their books. And I did pick up one of his books, the one he did with Bill Clinton some time ago. But I never got around to reading it. It just sat on my shelf for years. So I just decided, I kind of lost the interest in wanting to read it. So I just ended up donating it to make space on my bookshelf. As for Brian Sitz, I've never heard of him until I picked up this book. As for how I found out about this book, I had to go to my drugstore one day, and while I was in there looking around for the stuff that I needed, I decided just to take a quick look over in the books and magazines section. And when I did that, the cover for this book jumped right out at me. So this was a book I had no idea this was coming out. I hadn't heard any news about it or anything like that. So I picked it up and I was immediately intrigued and wanted to read it right away. So I almost picked up the physical paperback edition of this book, but I decided against it because I'm trying to save space on my bookshelf, so I'm going more in the direction of ebooks and only really going to pick up physical books that I really want, like special editions and things like that. So I got the ebook of this one instead. Now I'll break down a bit of the plot, so there may be some mild spoilers here in this part. So the story starts off in 1937, and Lamont Cranston and Margot Lane are out to their favorite restaurant, and they're celebrating, and they're reminiscing over their past adventures and things like that. And they both have a secret they want to tell each other. Margot is pregnant and she wants to tell Lamont, and Lamont has an engagement ring and he wants to propose to Margot Lane. So they order some food, and as they start eating their food, right away they realize something is wrong, or Lamont Cranston realizes something is wrong as Margot Lane falls over and she starts to foam at the mouth and things like that. Then his throat starts to restrict and all that. And he realizes they have been poisoned. So now he has to get them both out of there, out of the restaurant. And they go to this warehouse that is like a safe haven or a safe house that he's got set up. And there's a scientist there waiting for them. And so he just gets in through the door. Margot's already out. He's on his way out. And he says to the doctors that is there, we have to initiate the plan. So then after that, there is a time jump in the story. And the story then picks up in the year 2087, where we are introduced to a teenage girl called Maddie. And she's in school. And in this future, the schools are always in a constant state of lockdown. So there's always armed guards in the hallways and things like that. So you just can't come and go out of these schools. And on top of that, the world is now run by one government. There is a one world government, and that government is ruled by the world president. So she has an appointment with a lawyer, so she needs to escape her school. So Maddie has some mind control powers that she uses to get herself out of trouble. And so she actually uses that to basically do almost like a Jedi mind trick on one of the guards to get out of school to make it to this appointment with this lawyer. So when she meets up with this lawyer, she realizes that she has inherited something in a will. And so anyway, the lawyer can't tell her what it is. He just says it's at this address. So she goes to the address and it's a warehouse. So, and there's another doctor there. So she goes inside and asks him, okay, what did I inherit? Was it land, this warehouse, money, what? So he shows her what it is. And what it is the body of Lamont Cranston in suspended animation. So it's part of the will that she has to have him revived. So the doctor goes through the process of reviving Lamont Cranston, and it's actually her hypnotic or her mind control abilities that actually finally brings him out and back into the world of the living. So now Lamont Cranston, who has been in suspended animation for 150 years, and from his point of view, he just fell asleep in the 30s, and now it's 2087. So now he's in this totally alien world where all this technology has changed. It's this dystopian, authoritarian future, and his only guide that he has is this teenage girl named Maddie. And so that's where the story really kicks off from there. Now I'll go into my spoiler-free review. This book was a blast to read. I didn't know how I'd like it, as I've never read anything by James Patterson or Brian Sitz before, but from the first chapter, I was absolutely hooked and could not put this book down. So this is a reimagining of the character by these two writers. And even though it is a reimagining, they really stay true to the original concept of the Shadow, and they don't reimagine things too much. So I think if you're a fan of the original radio show, I think you'd really enjoy this book, as it stays really true to the spirit of the radio show, but it also expands upon the Shadow as well. Also, the story is really well paced. So while I was reading the story, there were no points where I got bored, or there was no points in the book where it dragged. It moved along really quick. As for the few flaws, there were a few plot points that I thought weren't really explained that well, or could have been explained a lot better, or they kind of like skipped over the details or glossed over details. But apparently this is the first of a series of books, so maybe that'll get explained in later books, but I think it all should have been explained in this book. So now we're going to be going into more heavy spoilers as I talk in more detail about the plot, and I start discussing things I liked about the book and I didn't like. So spoiler warning now. So here are some of the things I liked and some of the things that I didn't like. So right off the bat, what I really liked about this book is I think the writers did a really good job of capturing the characters of Lamont Cranston and Margot Lane. As I was reading this book, they really felt like the same characters that are in that old radio show. They don't feel like completely different, or they don't feel like bastardized versions of those characters. So they did a really good job of that. So the other thing I really liked is they did a good job of introducing new characters that kind of expanded upon the Shadow lore. And the characters are Maddie and her grandmother, Jessica. So in this story, Maddie is the one that inherits Lamont Cranston's body that was in stasis and brings him out. So as I was reading along, I was kind of getting worried that what if this might be a bait and switch? So we see this kind of happen. This is like a trend in pop culture now, like with the Star Wars films, where they said, well, these movies we're going to see the original cast come back. They do kind of come back, but really it's about all these new characters. And then you saw that in Masters of the Universe Revelations. Even though I did like that cartoon, a lot of fans wanted it to be about He-Man, and they felt a little bit cheated, where it was all of a sudden He-Man was pushed aside and it was all about Teela, and Teela was the central character. So I was kind of worried, now are they going to do that with this story? But they didn't. Now, with that being said, the Shadow really isn't the central character of the story. It is the character of Maddie, but it doesn't diminish or it doesn't destroy or push aside the character of the Shadow. The best example I can give, it's like Terminator 2. So Arnold's character, the Terminator, is the title character. He's the main character of the story. That's the character everyone wants to go see. But he is not the character that we, the audience, are taken along this ride for. That's not the character that the shoes were in. It's actually the character of John Connor. That's the character that we're anchored to, that kind of pulls us through the story. And that's the best example I can give of this. So the Shadow is the Terminator, and Maddie is the John Connor of the story. So that's the character we're kind of in her shoes, because she's the one that has to kind of explain this future world to John Connor, and not only him, or Lamont Cranston, not John Connor, but she has to explain this world to Lamont Cranston, the Shadow, and not only him, but us, the audience, as well. And so in that respect, she does become a legacy character, and so I think it was really well done. The writers did a really good job of that. And the other thing I really liked was the setting, the future dystopian setting of the story. And so you have this authoritarian government that's run by the world president, and in this society, it's really divided into two. You got two classes. You have the extreme poor and the extreme rich in this society, and you have these authoritarian thug police type people in this system that they patrol the streets, and they're called Tingrins in the story. And they're not really there to keep law. They're just there to keep all the poor people or all the underclass people subjugated. And so it made for a really interesting setting to take the Shadow out of the 1930s and put him in this dystopian setting. So the story has a bit of a science fiction flavor to it. And the other thing I really liked about this book, it had short chapters. So that really made it clip along fast. Like, it was a really fast read. Usually when I read books, a lot of times I kind of keep track of the pages. Okay, and especially if I'm not really into a book. Like, okay, now I've done 10 pages, 20 pages, things like that. But as I was reading this book, like, I was so engrossed in it that I wasn't doing that. So I would be just reading and reading and reading, and I'd check, and I'd already be 100 pages into the story. Like, by day 2, I had read 200 pages of this. So those are some of the things I liked. So as for some of my dislikes, so I don't have a lot of dislikes with this book, but there are some things. So some of the plot points were not clear to me, and they were glossed or even skipped over in the story that I thought were important and should have been explained. And the one thing that never made sense to me, or it's not explained, is why that point in time did Maddie get the will and inherit Lamont Cranston's body? And why was she the one that was chosen to bring him back to life? So why her, and why this point in time? Why the year 2087 as opposed to some other point in time? So that is never explained. So that whole process, that whole plan is not clear. So I wish that was explained. Now this is the first book apparently in a series of new Shadow books. So maybe it'll be explained in another book, but I think it really should have been explained in this book. So there were no questions when you were done reading it. The other thing, the main plot, the main evil scheme of the villain of the book, that gets thwarted almost like really fast and too easy when the time comes. And so I thought that was, I don't know, done rushed or done too fast. Could have been expanded a little bit more. It was almost like too easy of an obstacle for our main heroes to get over. So that was one of my nitpicks of it too. And lastly, oddly enough, even though it was one of my likes, it's also one of my dislikes, and that is the dystopian future setting. And the reason why I don't like it is because I don't mind the Shadow in this setting in a one-off story, but I don't think I would be down for this as a series of books. I much prefer the Shadow in the 1930s period instead of this future period where it's 2087. I'd rather him in that. I think it's a lot better for that noir detective feel to have it in that 1930s setting as opposed to this setting of the future. So as a one-off novel, I'm cool with it, but I don't know how I'd be with this as an ongoing series. And I don't know how this series is going to play out, if they're all going to take place in this time period, or if some of the stories will take place in the 1930s. But I have a suspicion this is where the story is going to take place from here on out into the future. So in conclusion, this was like a really fun read, and it read like an old pulp story. I mean, I just blew right through this book. And apparently, as I said before, this is the first book in a series of books. And apparently this may lead into a new live adaptation of the character, and I'm guessing the live adaptation will probably be based on these books. So right now the IP rights are currently in the hands of Condé Nast Entertainment, but the Shadow is due to enter the public domain in the year 2027. So who knows? The Shadow knows. So that's everything I got to say in this video. Let me know what you think in the comment section, and I will see you at the next one. I'd like to say thank you to all of my subscribers. I appreciate you all in helping this channel grow. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to hit the bell icon so you'll be notified when new videos are uploaded.